Hey everybody, it's Chris. This week is the 10th anniversary of my company, Power Company Climbing. It's also the 5th anniversary of my first book, The Hard Truth. And to be perfectly honest, it's the success of Power Company Climbing and some of the products we've made, like the book, The Hard Truth, and my new book, Adapt, that allow me to make this podcast. Yes, of course, the sponsorships help, and the Patreon is huge, and I appreciate all of that support. But what allowed me to develop this thing in the first place, when we had no idea if it would ever make any money, was the success of Power Company Climbing. So to celebrate that, we're having a big sale that starts at noon today. That's Mountain Time on Monday at noon, and lasts the entire week. So if you've been considering one of my books or any apparel or my recent Atomic Elements of Climbing Movement course, which I honestly think is a game changer, now is the time. And here's a little secret. I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe that you can still get an extra 20% off of the sale prices if you use the code STONE. As always, you can find the link right there in your show notes. Thank you. Season 2 of Written in Stone is supported by RAB. The mountains are our meeting place. And Tension Climbing, mastery over success. Alison Osius is easily one of the most impactful people in climbing media. It's not even a question. She helped to shape how so many climbers learned more about and engaged with the sport from the 80s into the 2000s. If you grew up in the time of print magazines, you know exactly what I'm talking about. She's a former editor at Climbing, Rock and Ice, and Outside. She's the first woman president of the American Alpine Club, wrote Second Ascent, the Hugh Herr story, and she's received the AAC Literary Award. She's absolutely a climbing legend. And in this episode, we discuss how she discovered climbing through journalism, her first times meeting the other top women of the 80s, and some of the first big competitions. And we also get Alison's side of the rivalry with Bobbi Bensman that we heard about last season from Bobbi. And of course, because she's a media legend, I ask her to theorize about the answers to nearly impossible questions. We start this conversation talking about a big event that happened shortly before we recorded. All right, let's get into it. Well, I want to start with, I think we sort of have to start with, because it's just happened, and it's such a beautiful, exciting thing to see Brooke Rabbitou doing what she's doing. And I know that's close to you, so I would just love to hear your reaction.
Well, the first thing I did was say, Mike, did you see this? That's Mike, my husband, Mike Benj.
Yeah.
And of course he already had. And the second thing I did was text Robin. And I said, Robin, I've said it before and I'll say it again. Congratulations to Brooke. And then I looked back and I've sent her so many texts over the years for different things that that Brooke has done. And it was just really fun because it's very historic. I mean, 515C, 9B plus is a really big step.
Yeah.
And only 2 other people had even done that route. And the Second Ascent took 2 years. And a lot of the best climbers had tried it before it even went. And so she's only the 3rd person. And there are, fewer than 10 climbers who've climbed at that level.
Yeah, not very many. It's
not many.
Especially, I got several messages on the internet just from people saying, do you feel like the universe is in your favor that you're doing this women climbing history of the 80s and then Brooke Rabbitou does this? And I'm like, I kind of do. It's so amazing that I'm researching all these women and then this seminal moment happens.
It is so amazing. And it's been a while since there was a great breakthrough for women,
Mm-hmm.
8 years or something. And it's just nice to see it be Brooke. she
Yeah.
she so deserves it. She really loves climbing.
Yeah.
I've just been following her for a long time because I would see her around a little bit as a little kid. I interviewed her at least once when she was probably still a teenager.
Yeah.
I remember being nervous for her to qualify for the first Olympics
Mm,
because it's just hard to qualify and anything can happen. And,
sure.
deserving people don't always qualify. And of course, you want to be objective. I mean, I was working at the climbing magazines at the time. We were covering lots of comp news, and I wanted to be objective and care about everybody who was out there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I also just knew that she deserved it and was hoping it would happen for her. And so I was really excited and relieved that she did get to go. And then
Yeah.
and that was Tokyo. That had to be, it was supposed to be 2020, but then it was
Right.
2021 because of COVID. And then by the time she qualified for Paris in 2024, I wasn't worried anymore.
No, not at all. I have this memory of Brooke that I've held on to for years. And it's funny, I actually have had several moments like this with Brooke, outside and indoors, where the first time was in the red. I had been working on this project forever and ever, it seemed like. And Brooke comes, and she's like 10 years old at the time, and just smashes my project in my face, And when she comes down, I'm stewing in my own ego there. And she comes down to the ground and looks right at me and says, "Do you want to see my sin dance?" I was like, you know what, kid? Yes, I do.
Yes, I do. And also, can you give me some beta?
Exactly. And she was so happy and just
Uh-huh.
so amazing. And then she did it to me. I was working on what would be my first V10, and she smashed that in my face too.
And did you learn anything? Did you pick up anything, or were you just too different in heights and everything else for her?
Well, what's funny is
sequences to work.
that boulder had a massive move on it, this huge span in a roof. And I thought, there's no way this kid is doing this. How on earth is she going to get through this section? And she did the wildest beta. I couldn't have imagined the beta she came up with. And it worked for her. And she did it so fast, in just a handful of tries. And I just wrote a book that went out a few months ago called Adapt, that is all about forget what you know when you come up to something you can't do, because there's a way. You just have to reimagine how you're doing things, whether that's a move, a situation, a life moment, whatever it is. There's a way through it, a way around it, something. And that was one of the most visceral moments of adaptation that I could have imagined.
Well, and rock climbing is one of the most interpretive
Yeah.
things that
Totally.
sports there is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I do remember when I watched her get her silver medal, and of course I was crying and choked up. And I texted Robin again. That first Olympics, that was a very intense time. I was still at climbing magazines. I had been at Rock and Ice, but then I was back at climbing again.
Yeah.
And we all stayed up all night covering the Olympics. And Dwayne Raleigh was loading photos, galleries up, and the rest of us were all writing as fast as we could and writing furiously. I do remember that Lynn and Bobbi and Hillary, Lynn Hill and Bobbi Bensman and Hillary Harris were all going to go over to Robin's house to watch. Robin couldn't go to Tokyo because of COVID. Robin and Didier couldn't go to Tokyo because of COVID. And I remember thinking that would be the most fun thing in the world if I could be at the house watching with them. I mean, of course, I lived 3.5 hours away, and it actually was really fun and crazy, working those 4 or 5 days, whatever we did, to do the online coverage that we did as quickly as possible. And the numbers went through the roof because everybody was really curious.
I imagine you have to be so on top of your game. And I think that creates this heightened sense of, or heightened all of your senses. So it just had to be a really fun time covering it.
Oh, it was. And I love that stuff. I mean, even long after I competed, I would go just about every year over to Vail for the Teva Mountain Games, which later became the GoPro Mountain Games.
Mm-hmm.
And whether we were covering it or not, sometimes there were issues as to who was covering it, who had sponsorship, things like that. I mean, it's only an hour and a half away anyway. So I would just go and watch and talk to the climbers and just get to see it. And for years, it was a national. At times, it was a World Cup. I think it was a World Cup and then went back to being a national and then became a World Cup again. And I watched most of them. I just liked being there. I just liked seeing it.
Yeah.
I remember once being at a trade show and there was a national going on the roof of the parking garage. Do you remember those events?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. I performed at one of those.
I bet you did.
Yeah, I opened it up.
Okay, good. Those were so fun.
Mm-hmm.
And I walked over because I wanted to see it. And who did I see sitting in the front row but Bobbi Bensman?
Of course.
So, of course, I sat down with her and we watched the whole thing and it was so fun. And plus, we didn't have to do anything. All we had to do was watch.
Yeah, that's so cool. And I want to get to you and Bobbi and, talk more about the media and all of that. But before we get there, I want to try to understand what was the scene in terms of other women climbing when you started climbing.
When I first started in the 70s, let me think, it was really spring of 77 with college friends. And I started because I went to a meeting of the college newspaper, the campus. This was at Middlebury. And the managing editor, Ned Farquhar, read off a list of topics that we could sign up to write about. At that time, I had done a few articles for my local newspaper when I did an internship in high school. And I had written once on ballet. And so the first thing I did was sign up for an article about dance. And so that was what I was going to do. But at the end of the meeting, Ned read off the list of the topics and who had signed up for each one. And he said, really, nobody wants to do this one on climbing? I would have thought that would be interesting. And I just made a split-second decision, and I raised my hand and said, I'll do that one. And that really changed everything for me.
Wow. So it started with media.
It did.
Wow.
It did. So he gave me a list of people to contact, and I maybe found a few more, but I went and interviewed these different people and ended up getting to go climbing with them a little bit. And those became close friends who remain close friends. And one of them was a woman, and that was Rebecca Upham. And she was a very important mentor, and she's still a close friend. She and the rest, Jeff Radford and Will Viner and Charlie Bates and Jack Sanderson, all of these people, in a way, they taught me climbing humor, I think, and gave me an attitude of just being humorous about it and not taking yourself too seriously.
That's really interesting. You just sort of popped something in my head there that when we call a person a climber, like I'm not a big fan of saying that person's a climber, that person's not really a climber. I'm not a fan of that, but there is a certain attitude, language that sort of comes along with identifying as a climber. And that's probably much harder to get if you just start with your friends who also have never climbed, and you're all learning it together, than it is if you start with someone who's already sort of entrenched in that world.
Yeah, and they were good mentors for me. Teaching safety, teaching rope work, things like that. And teaching, I mean, I still remember seeing Charlie Bates would always, if he saw a can in the woods, he would pick it up and put it in his pack and take it out and put it in the trash of the recycling.
So what was the woman's name?
Rebecca Upham.
Rebecca Upham. Were there other women that you met pretty quickly? Was she kind of the one?
She was the main one for a couple of years. There were a few women who climbed it in college, but not many. And maybe they were more interested in general mountaineering and hiking and things like that, and camping. I went away for junior year in Scotland, and Rebecca was there doing a postgrad year, and we did a bit of ice climbing there too. She was a really good ice climber. She's a good all-rounder, and we did some ice climbing there in Glencoe. The following summer, after I graduated, I went to North Wales, to the Plasy Brennan. It's the National Mountaineering Centre of the UK. And I stayed for half a year, maybe 5 months. And I had a friend there named Janice Cook. And I did do quite a bit of climbing with her. And that was a load of fun. She was from Canada. And we stayed in touch for a few years. And I'm sorry to say that then we lost touch. So if anybody out there knows Janice Cook, I think
Someone
people
will.
sometimes called her Cookie. Yeah, I would love to know where she is because she was a good friend. So I climbed a little. I climbed with her that summer and other partners. I mean, we were all living at the center. It was like one big dorm, and so there were always loads of people to go climbing with. But we climbed a lot together until she left. She left a couple months earlier than I did.
One of the things I've just recently learned about, and it's actually a really great resource online, is the Pinnacle Club, which was in the UK, had started in the UK early 1900s by women. It was just a group of women climbers that's grown over the years, and a who's who of legendary UK climbers are all members. And they have a great audio resource on the internet that they've recorded all of these stories from these women, and they're all there categorized on their website. So I spent hours listening to these women from the 1980s and 90s talking about climbing. Do you remember? I know Wales is a little bit removed from kind of the center of UK climbing, but did it feel like there was more of a female scene there?
No, I mean, I wish there were. I
Yeah.
know that Jill Lawrence was around.
Yeah, she's a big subject of the next episode that's coming out, actually.
Okay. Oh, good. Yeah, I knew she was around and that she was climbing hard. But I really didn't know of any others. And I do remember. I guess it was spring of '79. I remember I was climbing with a friend at Gimmer Crag in the Lake District. This was after I'd spent the year in Scotland. And I met Jeff Tabin, and we've been friends ever since. And I asked him, I really just didn't know of very many other women who climbed.
Yeah.
And I mean, I had been fortunate to have Rebecca to climb with, but we were also separate in those days. Everyone was
Right.
just in our own areas, and there weren't crowds at the cliffs, and you just didn't see very many people. So I just didn't know that many, or who was out there, or whether women could climb hard, or whether I could climb hard. I had not seen much. I had seen a little bit in the way of mountain books and magazines, but not much. And I asked Jeff, I said, do you know any other women who climb? And he said, Barbara Devine. And he told me she's done 512s in Yosemite. And so, and I was thinking, 512, that's really hard. So that was very encouraging. Like, yes, women can climb hard.
Yeah, I was just, I found an article by Jill Lawrence in an old mountain magazine talking about the French ladies' meet that happened in 1980 in the UK. And in it, she mentions, and this sort of blew my mind, she mentions that only one person in the entire meet had ever climbed in a group of only women. So this was the first time that nearly all of them had ever climbed with just other women.
Oh, and I think I remember that article. And I think that Katrine Destiville was
Yep.
at that meet and
Yep.
really opened some eyes.
Yep, that's who Jill partnered with for the meet, and Jill says she realized that she was physically strong enough but needed to figure out the psychological side of it, and she learned that by watching Destiville.
Oh, and I'm sure she
Yeah.
had things to teach Destiville about, I don't know, building anchors or something.
Yeah,
But
something.
although maybe Katrine already knew all that because
It was
she
still the
always-
trad era. Yeah.
Yeah, it was still a trad era, but she was young.
Mhm.
So who knows?
Do you remember the first time you really came across or met in person any of the like big names of the time female climbers?
Well, yeah. In summer, after I went to Wales, the next year I went to Yosemite
Mm.
and also went to Joshua Tree. And I saw Louise Shepard around in Yosemite.
Mm.
And in Joshua Tree, met Lynn Hill and met Mari Gingery and Mariah Craner. So
Wow.
how's that for good role
Yeah.
models?
Yeah. All women who I've been researching extensively. So I love
Yeah,
it.
I bet. Yeah. And then at some point, I was in North Conway, where I spent several summers, and Louise came through,
Mm.
and I I just found her so funny and so frank, and I felt like we hit it off. At least I thought so. And anyway, we did at least one day of climbing. We went up and did the Prow, and it was a great day. And she was so solid. And it's a lot of pitches. I don't know if it's 4 or 5, but it's hard pitches. And
Hmm.
so we had a really good day. And she invited me to come to this meet that she was organizing in Australia at Arapalis. And so I did go. That must have been 87.
Mm.
And stayed at her house. And I've always climbed with a lot of people. There were so many people around to climb with. And I think that as the organizer, she wasn't really coming out on the cliffs with us so much. So I don't know if I climbed with her at that meet. Maybe. But I had
Right.
to stay at her house. And there were, dozens of climbers around. It was a really good event.
Yeah. I've been emailing with Louise the past few days, just trying to figure out a time when we can talk. So I'm going to try to record with her soon.
Oh, I hope you find her. And after that, she became really involved in activism. Like she hung
Hmm.
a banner off a bridge, things like that, where she could use her climbing skills. And she's really outspoken and
Yeah.
she cares about issues. And, she may have been threatened with imprisonment, not,
Sure.
not been phased.
Yeah. One of the things I find really fascinating is that, Louise comes to North Conway and you two link up and climb together. And as I'm reading all of these stories through the 80s and digging in the magazines and digging online and talking to people, I'm realizing that all of these names who I had individually sort of decided these are the women that should be part of this story, they all connected in some way over the years, across oceans, and went and visited each other and sent letters to each other and would go across the ocean to climb with each other. And that seems mind-blowing to me. Maybe it shouldn't. I don't know. Did it just feel normal to do that? Or was it a special thing?
Well, I think it was really nice. And it is kind of amazing that it happened because you had to travel. But we were all freer in those days, I guess, penniless,
Sure.
but were able to pick up and go.
Well, I just read last night your essay about scarfing in the Yosemite cafeteria. So
Those were fun
so you
times.
made your penniless times work for you.
Yeah. Yes, yes. By the time I went to Australia, I actually had a job. But in Yosemite that summer, I didn't. I just lived. I went to Suicide and Talkeets. I went to Idlewild to guide later that summer. But for many, many weeks, and honestly, a few months, I was pretty casually employed. And we were all
Mm,
just living off nickels and dimes. And things like
yeah.
scarfing in that cafeteria really are very funny. They were fun times, and they're really funny memories that we all still laugh about.
Yeah, I bet. The first time I was in the cafeteria in Camp 4, well, first off, that day I met Tucker Tech, which was an event
Uh,
in itself. But I had already read all of these stories of people scarfing food in there, and I just thought, I don't need to, but I really want to. I just couldn't bring myself to do it.
So you never did?
I never did it.
So you never did? I don't know. We met all these people. The first time we did it, we weren't very good. And then these two guys came and sat down across from us, and they said, your technique really needs improving. And then they started showing us some tricks, like if you want to take something off the conveyor belt, you go take something up and set it on the conveyor belt, and in the same motion, take something off it. Things like that attract less attention.
Mentors.
And it became a whole
the
little
lost
scene.
art.
We had mentors. And that summer I was actually camped with two other women, Catherine Harris, who was my college roommate, and B.A. Doyle, who both remained my very close friends. And we all stayed in this big red tent that I had from childhood, LL Bean. And, it would blow down in a good stiff breeze of about 10, 15 miles per hour.
Yeah.
And at one point, our campcraft hadn't been very good, and we had it pointed toward a drainage, apparently, because the whole thing just built up. The water all came in and wouldn't go out. And I was reading Shogun, and it was like this thick, and it blew up, and it was just floating. We had to all scatter. I ended up sleeping under the boulder, the Midnight Lightning boulder.
I love it. One thing I want to try to understand, and we might have to do some theorizing here if you're willing to. It seems like, and maybe this is just that there's so much more information today that that I don't see as much of it. But when I'm researching the 80s, I come across so many more female first ascents than I hear about now. And I know that there's been a lot of talk in the sport climbing and bouldering age of why don't women do more first ascents? And there's certainly some reasons, like Title IX and women not being encouraged to do sports early on. But I'm curious why you think, or am I totally off base, first off, that it seems like more women were doing first ascents back then? And if that is the case, why?
Were more women doing first ascents back then? I think that Louise was unusual in that she did them very regularly.
Mm-hmm.
She was creative that way. She was out bolting. She was naming them. She did lots of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think others of us just did a scattering.
Got it.
Lynn did quite a few.
Yeah.
Including in Colorado.
Mm-hmm. Colorado, the Gunks, Yosemite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, yes, you bet. I think maybe Telluride, California. She did quite a few. Mariah did quite a few. I did some here and there, some FFAs, because there were more things around for the picking.
Right.
And then just kind of a scattering here and there in places that I lived, including, a couple around here, a few in New Hampshire.
Do you think it's that there aren't necessarily fewer women doing it now, but it's that there's so much going on all the time that we just don't hear about the women who are? I'm just curious. I know we're theorizing here, so.
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, information is so available now. We used to know very little about what other people were doing because people were in our own areas, or you'd take your trips. And, I remember getting mail at General Delivery, Yosemite Village.
Yep.
Nobody had cell phones. Nobody had the internet. People would wait until the magazines came out to find out different things that were going on. It was just harder to know what was happening then. But there was probably always more than we understood.
Sure. And I think that's true now. Even if we get tons and tons of news, we're constantly inundated. There's still a lot we don't hear about.
There's still a lot we don't hear about. Well, for example, Amber Johnstone lives in Newcastle, and she does a lot of new routing out at Maine Elk and in the area. Amber is married to Jeff Aki. They both have done so much, and the rest of us get to go over there and climb their routes and clip their anchors and lower off and have a really fun time. She does very good routes. I've always been the first in line to repeat her routes. She cleans them well. She bolts them well. They're well conceived. And, I guess those appear in the local guides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so many. I went through a phase this past summer. I was trying to finish I was trying to get 113s done, 105 13s. And
did you?
I got it on my 50th birthday. That was my goal, was to do it by the time I turned 50. And I did it the morning of my 50th birthday.
Just in time. That's a good mission.
And barely.
Congratulations.
But through the whole summer, I went through this phase of climbing almost exclusively Paul Piana and Heidi Badaracco routes, because she did so many great routes here in Lander.
Amy Skinner did a lot too.
Amy Skinner did some here too. And so there's a great community of women first ascensionists here. And I forget sometimes that I don't hear it elsewhere until I start reading about the 80s. And Louise Shepard actually was the person that brought it up in my mind.
Yeah, she did a lot. And she did them in some really committing there's some big gorge where she did new routes as well, I believe. And also in her home area of Arapiles.
Yeah. Were you going to other popular areas in the 80s? Like you mentioned Arapiles, and you were climbing in Wales and Scotland. Did you do Buchs and Smith and any of the other big areas?
Yes, I went to Buchs in 83 with the Women's Climbing Exchange. That was organized by the American Alpine Club, and we each got a grant to go.
Cool.
I wouldn't have been able to go otherwise, and I've always remembered that. And that was one reason that I was involved with the American Alpine Club over the years, is because they gave that to me at that time. And it was a month long. It was that fall. We went to Corsica and Fontainebleau and Buchs, and the women on that were Sue Giller and Rhea Dodd and Sandra Seeley and Pat Haythorne. And we did climb at Buchs. It wasn't, and in the Verdun, those weren't sport areas yet. They were bolted, but you also placed some nuts. I would usually take a rack, or at least a light rack, on most climbs. And then when I came back later, then Buchs had become all sport.
So you did go back when it was a sport scene?
Yes, that was in 87. I went back to meet, I think I was there skiing with my family, and then Lynn Hill was going there to climb at Buchs to prepare to compete at Bercy in Paris. And that was what people did in those days. Everybody went to cliffs to climb. So I met her after my ski trip. I met her in Apt, and we stayed in a caravan and climbed for a few weeks. She and I and this good friend named Spider McKenzie, John Spider McKenzie, climbed together for weeks, and we still laugh about those days. And
I think Lynn just told me about Spider.
I bet she did.
I think she did. I just interviewed her a couple of weeks ago, and I'm pretty sure Spider came up. So it must have been this in this story.
There can't be too many spiders. Spider was a really good climber.
What was the scene like at Buchs at that time?
Well, it was winter. So it wasn't very lively, and it would have been kind of rough to be camping because it'd just be cold. But we had caravan. We, were able to rent a little place, and then you can cook inside that, and you can sit in there at night. And so we all three cooked together and climbed together, and that was really fun. I'm actually I really make an effort to stay in touch with people, and I've stayed in touch with Spider, and I'm going to Scotland this fall to do.
That's what it was. That's how it came up. Lynn told me that you were going to Scotland, and you had told her that you were going to get in contact with Spider, or that you were going to see Spider.
That's right.
That's right.
I'm going to fly into Edinburgh, and I want to try to see him. It's only been since 87.
Wow. I wish I was as good at that as you are.
Well, I lose touch with people too, but I really try. And there's so many ways to do it these days. We used to have to write letters, and we did that.
Yeah, well, I want to rewind to that now that you've brought the letters back up. That's a fascinating thing, this getting in contact with all of these other climbers. Like Louise Shepard comes to North Conway. She can't just call your cell phone to say, "Hey, Allison, do you want to go climbing?"
No,
There has to be a way to get in touch.
you'd have to figure it out. I don't know how she found me in North Conway. She may have been there with a mutual friend. I don't remember who she arrived with or who she was traveling with right then. You're right. People stayed in touch. We would write those blue airmail letters that you folded. You're not looking like you've ever seen one before, but maybe you have. They're called aerograms or something. That
I've heard of this. I don't think I've ever seen one, but I have heard of this.
Yeah, you folded them. I have a file there where I have a bunch of them from people like Louise.
Really?
We wrote letters here and there. I wouldn't be very often. It wouldn't be like emailing every week. It might be a letter a year or a letter every 6 months or something
Yeah.
like that. But we did stay in touch a little bit over the years. And it's nice to have those. Like I was looking in my files and I have old letters from Ed Webster. And,
Mm,
they're nice to look at because he's gone now.
yep. Yeah. That's one of the things when I first came to Lander, Amy let me go through a box of letters that Paul and Todd and she had written back and forth over the years. And it was just a really great time sitting and reading all of these letters and how differently people communicated when it was in a letter form that you weren't going to talk to them the next day.
And they're so nice to have. And I think that is something that's been lost.
Yeah,
And now,
absolutely.
we used to have to pay for phone calls
Hmm.
if we even had a place to live with a phone. I lived in
Right,
apartments where I
right.
had no phone,
Yeah.
but we would have to pay. And you'd try to wait until 11 o'clock at night, so it'd be cheaper, but that's getting kind of late. And you'd make a phone call, and then you'd get your phone bill, and this phone call was $8 and this was 12 and this was 15, and those things added up a lot. And
Hmm.
actually, for me, it's an incredible feeling of freedom to have a cell phone where I can call people and talk all I want and not think
Yeah,
about the cost.
I bet. And
That's
now
a
we're
huge
like,
change in my life.
it's like the Jetsons, you and I
Yeah,
sitting in, hundreds and hundreds of miles apart, talking face to face.
talking face to face. And it's so nice because I can see you smiling at something and know that you're getting what I'm
Hmm.
saying.
Hmm. What about Smith? Did you spend any time there when it was sort of on the come up?
I did. I went to Smith before Snowbird because,
Mm,
again, that was what we used to do to prepare. Like I was living in Boston. You could be there all winter without climbing, or you could go up to North Conway for weekends and then it rains and you couldn't climb. There was no gym.
mhm,
I mean, I still remember when I went up a stairway in North Conway and saw those Metolius panels on the wall. That was
mm,
probably a couple of years later. But I remember looking at those and thinking, that is fantastic. And they were just those panels on a vertical surface. But I just
right.
remember thinking, wouldn't it be great to have those? But at that time, we would get ready for a comp by going climbing. And that would mean if you're going to a World Cup in Europe, that would mean going to southern France. So you'd make it a whole climbing trip, which was
Right.
great. You'd have a whole gang of people. But yeah, that year I went to Smith Rock. I had my little tent. I had it in Mike Volk's yard.
Not the big
Even
red tent anymore?
it would no, not the big. By this time, I had gotten a little North Face bullfrog that I still have. It's a really good
Wow.
tent, and so I put it in Mike Volk's yard because he would
Mhm.
let you do that for $1 a night or something, and that was really handy. And so I climbed there for maybe 2 weeks to try to get in some climbing before Snowbird, and there were plenty of people there and lots of and people to climb with. And then when I went to Snowbird to compete, that was the first time I'd ever climbed on an artificial wall.
Oh, really? Yeah, that's something we all take for granted. Like
Mhm.
competitions now, you can train very specifically for those competitions by climbing on the exact same holds you're going to climb at a lot of the time or
Yeah, and
climb
it
on a
really
lot of the
helps to
time.
know them. Mhm.
Yeah, and back then, you had never even been on an artificial wall. I imagine a lot
Never
of
been
people
on one.
hadn't.
Maybe. And I still remember this was all just part of things changing. I remember, what year did I go that year? Let's say it was in 1990, maybe 89. I remember going to Europe to do, because I would just go over and spend 2 weeks and do a World Cup on either end and go climbing in between.
Mhm.
But I remember seeing Dale Goddard and Jeff Wigand, and I saw them at some comp, and they had arrived and just gone to Belgium and gone climbing because Belgium had really great early gyms.
Mm.
And we were just laughing, not at them, with them, that, like, really, you've been here in Europe and you were climbing indoors? And they said, yeah, these gyms are so great. But we had all been down because it was, let's go rock climbing.
Yeah. Bringing Belgium into this as one of the first places to have indoor gyms is really fascinating. I talked to Arnaud to Kent
Mhm,
earlier this season with Gibet. They were both in
mhm.
10 Sleep, and I went over and talked with them. And talking to him, I learned that the Belgians were already doing something that was similar to red pointing called in yellow.
I've never heard of this.
And rather than painting a red dot on the wall like Kurt Albert did, they would paint the pitons yellow if they had been free climbed past and not used as aid.
Oh,
And and I just found it fascinating that they had come up with this system in such a similar way to communicate with other people before red pointing happened. And also now I'm hearing they were one of the first places in Europe to have indoor gyms. It seems like such a tiny country, they were ahead of things
mhm.
a little.
Innovative. Well,
Yeah.
really, I think all it takes is a few leaders, a
Mhm.
few early adopters.
Yeah, absolutely. Can we hang out at Snowbird for just a minute before we sort of back out and move on with things?
Sure,
Um,
you're pretty organized.
I would just love to know about what that was like. First big comp, uh, first international comp in America, right? And I believe you've
Right.
written about Snowbird before. Is that
I
correct?
have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did for Gym Climber, that
Okay.
short-lived but very nice
Yep.
magazine.
Yeah.
Francis Cesaro and Delaney Miller uh,
Hmm.
did a really nice job with it. Francis asked me to write a feature about Snowbird, and so I went back in time.
Yeah.
That
So
so that was in '88. Um, my first contact with any kind of competition climbing had been in '87 when I went to France, um, at the behest of Jim McCarthy and the American Alpine Club, to join this UIAA commission that was hammering out rules
mm,
for this new genre of climbing, for comp climbing. It was this meeting that was held in Chambéry, and I went climbing a little bit after that, and that was the first time I did sport climbing, and the first time I hang dogged, which I wouldn't have been allowed to do at other places I climbed,
wow, I love
and the
it.
first time I just clip bolts. Um, then it was later that year that I climbed with Lynn at Bukes, and that's how I came to watch at Bercy and saw Didier Rabutu win, and saw what
Mm,
a great uh, sports rivalry Lynn and Katrine were. They were both so good. They were head and shoulders above everybody else. But you could see that Isabelle Patissier, even though she was kind of always coming in third, you could see that she was really talented
yeah, she was
and
on the come
and
up.
yeah, and promising. And I remember watching that and thinking, I don't know if I could ever do that. It just looked so scary. They would come out, there's this huge auditorium full of people. I'd never seen any such thing in climbing. They
Yeah.
would come out, they would look so alone, and they'd have a spotlight on them and start climbing. And I thought, I don't know if I could ever do that. But I couldn't help watching from the audience, looking at the holds and thinking, well, what would I do right there? And I wonder if I could get that next one. So then you start getting curious and you do start wanting to do it. And so when I was invited to Snowbird, I was pretty excited to go. And it was partly very social because there just weren't that many ways in those days where you would see other members of the climbing community. Trade shows and maybe the American Alpine Club meeting. So those things are twice a year or something. But here were dozens and dozens of really good climbers all in the same place. And it was a beautiful place to be. And this comp came at this huge time of change. And both sport climbing and competition climbing were very controversial. They were areas of real conflict because there were people who opposed rat bolting and sport and just sport climbing, and there were and hang dogging. Which, in retrospect, it's like, why would anybody have ever cared about hang dogging? It hurts nothing, but they did. And in terms of competition climbing, I think people felt like it takes away from the experience that we're all seeking, or that we at least think we're seeking. And that was to be doing this thing that was very personal and pure, and you're up in the air above the trees and away from it all. And there were very leading climbers of the day who turned it down. Peter Croft wanted nothing to do with it. Beth Bennett was a really good climber of the era who said no.
There was a whole contingent of French who had signed a document, right, saying that they would not compete.
They did. And I think I would have to look at John Bergman's book again, High Drama. It's a really good book. I think what changed people's minds, if I'm remembering right, was the idea of doing it on artificial surfaces. Because then you weren't harming the environment.
Sure,
and you
that makes total sense.
Putting all those crowds and making these routes right on top of each other and bringing people tromping on all the plants and everything else. So all these people converged, and we were there for, I guess, 3 days. And there were the semis, and then on the day of the finals, the semis were in beautiful weather, and then we moved through to the finals the next day, and that was on a gray, kind of grim day, and the whole thing was being televised. It was this huge spectacle, and I really give Jeff Lowe and his crew credit for just pulling it off. And it was being televised. CBS was televising it. And that was only thanks to Bob Carmichael, who had filmed Survival of the Fittest over the years. And he pitched them. And amazingly, they said yes on this. They took a real flyer on this weird sport. So the wall is going up the side of the cliff lodge. And, we just got some gray mountain weather. And when the men's event occurred, people just kept falling and falling and falling. And it was not great for the TV cameras because the roof was supposed to be the big, exciting, telegenic climax of the climb, and nobody was getting anywhere near it. And so apparently, I heard this later when I researched this story, Chris Noble said that he heard, he was a photographer hanging on the wall, and he said he heard this radio transmission where somebody from the control booth was radioing Bob Carmichael, who was head of the film crew, and saying, "Man, this whole thing sucks." And Carmichael said, "Don't worry, someone will make it to the top." And whoever it was said, "Who? There's only one guy left." But guess who that was? And Patrick Edlanger came out, and he had on his Walkman. People had Walkman then. And he didn't even look at the wall. That's just all part of the legend, but it happened. He didn't even look at the wall. He just started climbing. And he was a really beautiful, precise climber to watch. He got up to the roof, and every hold he hit created this huge burst, this huge roar from the crowd. And he got to the lip. And it really is true that the sun came
I've
out.
read this so many times.
And sometimes I wonder if I remember seeing it or if I just remember that that's part of the lore, that I've read it so many times. But it did. That happened. And he came over the roof, and there was a camera guy up above named Tommy Rowe who was focused on that hold over the roof. And Patrick's hand slapped onto it and locked onto it, and he was focused, and it made this really great frame.
Mm-hmm.
And anybody who watched it just understood that we were seeing a great moment in terms of athleticism.
Yeah.
And it also created this great convergence.
Athleticism and nature combining with the sun bursting through onto Ed Lange's flowing golden hair. Yeah.
And everyone will always remember that. And as he came down and everybody was going nuts, he saw Henry Barber and Michael Kennedy on a balcony. And apparently, as a 17-year-old, Patrick had been really inspired by Henry's solos and Henry's purity of style. And Henry had been one of the people who was concerned about sport climbing and
Sure,
vaulting
yeah.
and maybe to a lesser extent competitions, because this one was on the side of a building. It wasn't outside. But anyway, Patrick saw Henry and he pointed at him and he said, "For you."
Mm.
And well, that will have convinced Henry.
Yeah.
And that was an incredible tribute in that moment. And really that, I would say, that day was a big validation of both comp climbing and sport climbing.
Mm. Yeah, it seems like that was, if I'm looking at the 80s and trying to come up with what were the major shifts in climbing, that certainly seems like one of the big shifts that really allowed the 90s to unfold the way that they did, especially in America.
I think it was. And of course, there are lots and lots of events and elements along the way. I think among the things that happened was, Alan Watts had the vision to see what Smith Rock could be, and he was so good about getting people to come there and climb with him and see the place. It's really good. Come here.
I think he set for Snowbird as well. Is that right?
He did.
Really amazing what that guy contributed in the 80s.
Well, it was. And he got the world to come to Smith.
Yeah.
And he also got, in the months, I believe, before Snowbird, he got Backer, because of what he had going there. Both John Backer and Ron Kalk visited to see what this new sport climbing thing was about. And Backer didn't care for it, and so he left. But Ron was interested. And he stayed, and he did a 513, and he was open to it. And then over the years, he went to Europe, and he did a lot of competitions. And it's all just one facet of his career that involved a lot of things. And when I think of Ron, I do think of something that's a little bit underappreciated, or just one of those things that could have happened. The following year, there was another World Cup at Snowbird, so that would have been 89. And in the finals, Ron got up to the roof, and he was under the roof, and he had just looked great getting there. And he said afterwards that he just made some sort of mistake, maybe with his foot. He loaded up his arms a little bit too much, and then you're just off. Things happen so fast.
Yeah.
But it looked like he could have won that comp. And Ron could have won a very early World Cup in his own country. And you see a few of those moments, and they get a little bit lost to time.
Absolutely.
Like Corinne Lebrun, that first time at Snowbird, Corinne Lebrun in the semis had the top finish. So if that was the finals, she'd have won the World Cup.
Yeah. When I was talking to Jeff Smoot earlier this season about Backer and Croft, he mentioned to me that somewhere there was a photo of Backer on To Bolt or Not to Be, hangdogging, and Todd Skinner is in the foreground looking at the camera laughing
Like,
because he's so shocked at what's being
yep.
photographed. And I just came across that photo in an old
you
Mountain
found it?
magazine. It's really small, but it's very obviously Backer being belayed by Mari on To Bolt or Not to Be, with Todd just cackling in the foreground.
Todd was interested. Yeah, and I remember Todd was interested. He was there pretty early in Smith, checking it out.
Yeah, for sure. Let's shift into media, because first off, I'm fascinated that that's how you got into climbing. I would have assumed you started climbing and eventually everyone wants to find a job in climbing, and media is one of those jobs, but you came into it that way. Were there other women in climbing media that you looked up to along the way? Or were you one of the, I mean, you were certainly one of the first, but what did that landscape look like for you?
Let's see. I think I published my first article in Mountain Magazine, and that would have been, I don't know, maybe 1980. And the staff, that was, what was his name? Tim Lewis, Tim something. I think it was Tim Lewis.
Don't know.
And I remember very early on enjoying the writing of Jill Kent, because she was very comedic as well as a talented writer. And pretty early, she bought On the Edge. So she was a woman editor-publisher. Beth Wald did both excellent photography, and she actually used to write and was a good writer. Later on, I read Maria Coffey, A Fragile Edge, and then more recently, I just read her memoir instead, and they're both excellent. I guess in the same way that I climbed with women, but I always climbed with a lot of different people. I read some women writers, but I always read a lot of writers. In journalism, I went to graduate school in journalism. I went to the Columbia School of Journalism, and I took a class that was very influential to me. It was called Journalism as Literature. And I was very influenced by John Hersey and the book Hiroshima, where he chose this huge event that involved hundreds of thousands of people, and he made it effective by following the lives of only a handful of people. And you saw everything through their eyes. And he had a very muted tone that made the work all the more eloquent. I studied Oriana Fallaci at that time. She was the first person that I had ever seen who was really good at Q&A. And I read Joan Didion, but also read John McPhee. Like a lot of all young journalists at that time really liked John McPhee. But I liked how, I read his book Oranges, and I really liked how he made me care about oranges, which I had never known anything about, or Levels of the Game. It's about a tennis match, and I think it's kind of a minor tennis match, but he brings in all this background, and I didn't care about tennis, but it was riveting.
Similar to what like a Malcolm Gladwell does today, like looking at a seemingly small event and showing you how it relates to everything, that kind of.
Yes. And going into the details and the levels of meaning in it. In Levels of the Game, whether someone could even change, think on his feet and change, or whether someone was more committed to the established way of doing things.
What about women in climbing business? I know. Well, first, let me ask you this: you said Jill Kent, and I've only read it, so I read Gil. Do you know if it was Gil Price or Jill Price?
I think it was Jill.
Okay, I'm just trying to make sure I get all these pronunciations right.
Yeah, that's that.
So, what about the world of climbing business and, sort of organizations? You were the first female president of the Alpine Club, right?
Oh, so I just remembered another person who was a good writer early on, and that was Rosie Andrews.
Rosie Andrews.
And Louise Shepard wrote really well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually read, and I had to search for it, and Alan Watts sent me photos from an article Rosie Andrews wrote called "No Spare Rib."
Oh, right.
That I
Rosie
wanted
wrote
to
that
read
one.
for research around this Women in Climbing series.
That one was a pretty seminal story because it just opened people's eyes to the fact that women were climbing hard.
Yeah.
And there were photos and just sort of stories from all these different places. And there was a lot of value in just putting them all in one place where people could see them.
Yeah. And the
And yeah,
photos
Rosie
in
wrote
the
that.
article are like these muscular, ripped women. And seeing them, I think it came out in 83 or 84, something like that. And seeing those photos and knowing that those same conversations would happen, continue to happen all the way until today. I still see them on the internet. When there's a beautiful photo of a muscular woman, inevitably there's going to be comments from men who are like, that's not what a woman is supposed to look like, kind
Anybody
of
still
thing.
says that?
People still say it, Allison. So to see those photos in the 80s too was really great.
I will say one of my favorite things these days is when I go to the gym and see little girls and young women growing up strong, because it
Yeah,
wasn't that way in my era. You just weren't
totally.
encouraged to do things with your arms. Um, and I remember one woman saying, "Well, I was doing weights, but I had to stop. I was getting too pumped looking."
Right, right.
So,
Yeah, it's beautiful that it's changing,
yeah,
and to see that women in the 80s had already started the ball rolling of change that was then picked up by the Alex Puccios is really great.
yeah.
Women in business. I know you were Alpine Club. I know Mariah Craner started BD essentially out of Chenard. And Jill Kent bought On the Edge. Coral Bowman and Louise Shepard both had climbing schools for women. Who else?
Kim Reynolds. Kim Reynolds was an early guide and business owner. She, I believe, founded Chicks with Picks, and then later on, Kitty
Ah,
Calhoun owned it
yep,
for
yeah,
years, and then sold it to somebody else.
yeah,
Also, it's also that's been women owned all along, and it's been super successful because a lot of studies and so on have shown that a lot of women might be more successful or just more willing to learn
mm,
in a group with other women, especially when it's something that's so different, like climbing and ice climbing, so different from what they
yeah,
might have ever done before.
absolutely. I love that. Yeah, I sort of had this thought when I talked with Lynn because it was a very last minute conversation with Lynn, and um, I ended up just throwing out a bunch of the names. It was early in my research, and I just wanted her take on all of these names I had come across of women who I hadn't heard about before. And it was really fascinating that Lynn knew where they all were. And
Today,
yeah, and it occurred to
uh-huh.
me that I am really terrible at keeping up with people from my past. Um, but when I talked to you, when I talked with Bobbi last season, when I talked with Lynn, you know where everyone is and you try to keep up with everyone to some degree. And I find that really beautiful.
Well, and it's so easy these days. There's so many ways to do it, and then you're so
Yeah,
glad.
absolutely.
And unfortunately, I've gotten to the age and stage in life where we lose people, not only to accidents but to natural
Hmm.
causes. And then sometimes I'm so glad that, oh my gosh, at least a year and a half ago, I emailed that person and we had a nice exchange.
Can we talk Bobbi and that rivalry?
Sure.
Bobbi's one of my favorite people to run into, to talk to be around. She's just an incredible force of nature. So I would love to hear your side of that rivalry because we got hers last season.
Well, there again, I might not have known her. She was, if it weren't for comps, she was at the time largely based in Arizona. I was wherever I was. I was kind of peripatetic for a while. But we met at comps. And
wait a minute. Wait, I have to stop you.
Yep.
You just said peripatetic, and the only time I've ever seen that word was in an article about Russ Clune. Did you write that?
I don't think so. I think Susan Rogers wrote the first big profile of him, and she might have used it. But the word suits him.
Okay, I was just curious.
He's been
because
everywhere.
The article was called The Peripatetic Russ Clune, and I had to go look it up. Back in the 90s or early 2000s, I went and looked the word up in an actual dictionary, so I knew what it meant. Anyway.
Oh, Susan Rogers.
Sorry.
There's another good writer, climber, talented climber. Yeah, but so I met her. I may have met her for the first time at a trade show or something, but we got to know each other at comps. And similarly, Susan Price, who became a lifelong friend. I just would never have known them if not for the Danskin series. Again, that was Jeff Lowe and Paul Sibley and Roy McClanahan, that whole crew. And that was a way that we would get together and just see each other several times a year and room together. Mm-hmm. I would see Bobbi at ISO, and I mean, she's so exuberant and she's fun and she's outspoken. So of course we would hang out. We'd all be back there for hours. So it's a lot of hang time. Yeah. And there still weren't, I don't think there was the internet or cell phones then. So I don't think we were all in touch a ton in between, but there were these regular meetups. And then what would happen sometimes is that she and I would tie in the finals and go into a super final. So we'd be back, just the two of us, for a long time. And she would just be really nice. It was, I guess it could have been unfriendly or tense, but that would have been dumb.
Yeah.
And that's not her personality or mine, I hope. And I would make her laugh sometimes. And it's true that I sent her chocolate in between because we were going back and forth. So I sent her the biggest bar of chocolate you've ever seen in your life. I was trying to weigh her down.
Yeah.
We've stayed, I still see her. Like if I'm at a trade show, I'd always try to go find her. Mm-hmm. Or I would see her sometimes at the Teva Games. And we roomed together at the very first X Games.
Oh, right. Wow, the X Games haven't even made it into any of this yet.
The X Games, that was a big deal. It was, the
absolutely.
Very first one, it was 95 in Providence, Rhode Island. And it was the Extreme Games then. Mm-hmm. And I think the theme of it was, you ready for this? Not, are you ready for this? But you ready for this? Question mark.
Spoken like a true journalist.
Yeah. Shelley Preston was there, Gia Franklin. There were people from Europe, and people came from all around the world. It was Ralphie Renzo and Mike Pont was course setting. I think Hans Florine was course setting. Steve Hong.
Right.
And I think it was after sort of a lull in terms of World Cups, because Jeff Lowe had put on the 88 and 89 and 91 World Cups. The first two were at Snowbird, and then the last one was at Berkeley. And then those were, in retrospect, maybe putting the horse before the cart, because then what came next was this naturally growing scene of national events. And so then there was a pause on World Cups. This was when I think the first international event, this was when that resumed. And so all these people came to that. And Bobbi and I, she was living in Colorado at the time, and I had a toddler, and we trained together. She would come over to my house because I had a wall. We had a wall, Mike and I had a small one in the garage. And so Bobbi would come over. It was sort of easier for her. She was living in Rifle to climb, but I think she just felt that she was being nice about it. Like I had this little kid, so she would do the driving. And it, it had a wall too, so it all worked together. But we would play add-on in my garage for hours, and then we roomed together there with Liz Grenard.
Oh,
and
sure.
that was such a fun time. That was one of the best times I ever had at an event. And it was partly, well, for one thing, they gave us rooms, which was nice. And of course, we were always sneaking people in and out, letting other people stay with us and so on, and got in trouble. And they gave us meals. It had always been so scrappy, and people were scattered all around wherever they could find a place to stay or whatever. But we were all together. But she and Liz and I had more fun, and we laughed the whole time. And it was just a really good comp experience the whole way.
I can't imagine not having fun with Bobbi.
I know, it's true.
How do you feel about the way comps have evolved?
It's so exciting to watch them, but I also think I don't even know if I could do that.
Oh, for sure.
And I think I was kind of lucky that I was in it when I was in it. But, over time, they changed, because it used to be, imagine this, you'd be at a World Cup or anything else, and each person would come out one by one and have 5 minutes to look at the route. And only after some time, I know, can you imagine being in the audience when every single person has that? And then you climb, and it takes a long time, like maybe 11 minutes or whatever. These things took all day. And then they changed it so that everybody comes out and looks at the route together.
That's actually one of my favorite parts as an MC, is when everyone comes out, because I get to sort of explain to the crowd the camaraderie that everyone has and the community that everyone has, and how they're all sharing beta and talking with each other. And so that's one of my favorite parts as an MC.
Well, and it's such a nice moment, because I remember a kind of a well-known photo of Jim Karn and Scott Franklin and Doug Engelkirk. They were early leaders, and they were out there. Look, that nice moment when their faces are upturned, they're all looking at it, and they're moving their hands and talking to each other about and sharing their ideas about what they're going to do. And so then another thing that changed, and this had to be 20 years ago, was when these bouldering contests started happening, and you'd have 5 people out climbing on different panels at once.
Right.
And that was way, way better than just one person after another. And, you sometimes couldn't even decide who to watch. And that's still the way it is. And that's a great show. I do remember one of the most wonderful shows in World Cups was, what always used to happen was, let's say, Lynn and Catherine, or Lynn and Isabelle Patissier, or whoever, tied in the finals. They would always put the women on the men's final for their tiebreaker, for their super final. And that was the best show in town. Everybody thought so.
Mm.
And I was there in Lyon. And I got to see a lot of really wonderful moments. I got to see Robin win at Leeds. I got to see Jerry win at Leeds. I saw at Langeais. I saw Lynn that night at Lyon, and this was after she had been hurt that summer. She took the 80-foot fall at
Took
Buttes,
the fall,
and, and then she recovered. And at Lyon, she and Isabel were put on the men's final route for their tiebreaker. And I think that Isabel climbed really well and, got up, 50 feet. And then Lynn came out, and we had just seen the men finalists all falling all the way up this, at different places, all the way up this route.
Right.
And we saw Lynn come out, and she just kept passing one crux after another, after another, after another. And only 2 men, it was Didier and Simon Naden, only 2 men had gotten to the top. And she got all the way up there, and then she made this huge jump at the top, and she nailed it. And that was also one of the finest athletic performances I will ever see.
Yeah.
And she would have Yeah, she would have been at least in the top 3 among men and women, that event.
I've been thinking about this a lot lately, through writing these last 2 seasons about the 90s and now the 80s. And when I put out the Free Nose and Nose in a Day episode last season, I made the comment that it was certainly one of the biggest achievements of the 90s, maybe the biggest climbing achievement of the 90s. And of course, I got some pushback from people, saying, no, this was the biggest accomplishment. This was the biggest accomplishment. And everyone's entitled to their opinion.
Oh, it makes good discussion.
But I've been thinking about it a lot recently because I can't come up with another climbing achievement in all of climbing history that if you took that one person out of the equation, someone else wasn't going to come and do the thing. If Wolfgang doesn't climb Action Direct, Ben Moon had still done Hubble. And someone would do Action Direct soon. If Lynn didn't do the nose when she did it, it was probably not going to get done for a long time.
Well, I totally appreciate that you talked about both freeing the nose and doing it a year later in a day.
Yeah.
Because I feel like freeing the nose has been celebrated properly. And at least at the time, it felt like doing it in a day wasn't always understood to be what it was. It was so much harder.
So monumental.
She did the first time. So monumental and so much harder. She said she had to turn herself into a different climber to do that.
Well, I talked with Russ Clune about her earlier this season, and I asked Russ, when was the moment you knew she was going to be the Lynn Hill? And he said, I went and visited her in France when she was training to do the nose in a day, and she was on a different level, a level no one had ever been at. And she didn't even realize the level she was at, but it blew me away.
That one, I mean, you can't help thinking that it is her best moment ever. She probably would say the same thing.
Yeah. Incredible. Who are the other women these days who are really impressing you? I feel like we're at a moment these last few years where we get to see obviously what Brooke has done. Michaela is climbing V15
she just keeps
and
on keeping
15B.
on.
She just keeps getting better.
And I love it that they can do it all. And Brooke, too. They do bouldering and roots.
Yeah. And Babsy, flashing free rider.
Well, and she does all of it and lots of trad. And she really is badass. She just does, everything from bouldering to wall after wall after wall in Yosemite.
Yeah. Do you enjoy watching Yanya? Is it
Oh, yeah.
Do you like that sort of dominance?
Well, you just couldn't help being moved that year that she won every World Cup she entered.
Yeah.
And on the last one, she cried. I'm sure I cried too. And when she got the gold medal at the Olympics, I was so glad because, come on, she totally deserved it.
So fun to watch women's climbing. And now that I'm like digging back into the 80s and my whole goal with this is to sort of connect the dots deeper than we usually do. Lynn gets a lot of the press, which she deserves, and I'm not saying she shouldn't, but who else was there besides Lynn and Catherine Destavel? And there were a lot. And now going back into it deeper and learning about the Diana Hunters and the Beth Bennett's and Coral Bowman and Louise Shepard and all of these other women has been really, it gives me the same feeling that women's climbing today does when I'm watching the Michaelas and the Brooks and the Yanyas and the Babsies. And of course, the Beth Roddens and the Katie Browns and all of the women who were there between the 80s and now.
Emily Harrington won. She won an international event. Serge.
Yeah.
Lisa Rance.
and still doing incredible things. So
I'm sure as soon as this call is over, I'm going to be kicking myself thinking,
you're going to
why
remember
didn't I talk
20
about
more.
this and that person? Well, I mean,
Yeah.
Nanette Raybaud was really, really good.
Mhm.
She won World Cups. If we're going way back, let's look at Catherine Freer. She did everything.
Catherine Freer, she plays a part in these episodes, and Luisa
Yeah.
Giovanni plays a part
Yeah.
in these episodes. Yeah.
Catherine Freer and Julie Brugger were a good, strong climbing partnership.
I don't know Julie Brugger at all.
I just remember them being in Yosemite and doing the rostrum.
Mm.
Or they were just both really strong early climbers. And I only met Julie once, but I did know Catherine. We were friends, and she did. She was a really good rock climber. She was also she big walls, in Yosemite, and she then did some alpinism and mountaineering. And sad to say, she's not here anymore. But every now and then I've kind of said something to a current woman climber, and I say something about Catherine Freer, and they say, "Oh, who's that?" And it always hurts my heart. It's like, it would be nice to have her remembered, because she was very good and very strong and really interested in supporting other women.
Yeah. And that's sort of my hope with all of this. And I said this to my patrons at the end of the first part in this series, that I hope by digging in and doing a cursory look at all of these women and trying to connect all of these dots about how they were pushing each other and moving things forward across the world, that some woman hears these stories and says, "Oh, I want to know more about these women," and takes it upon themselves. And please, if you're hearing this now, reach out to me. I would love to give you my connections and help with whatever history I've dug up, to tell these stories and to go deeper into these stories of the Catherine Freers and the Rosie Andrews and the Jill Lawrence and so on and so on.
You've done a lot of research, and I really appreciate that.
That means
Yeah.
a whole hell of a lot coming from you. So thank you for that. And thank you for taking all this time. We're like hour 40, and you were nervous about an hour. So
Well, cut it down as short as you want. I always write long, and apparently I always talk long.
Well, I love it, and I love getting to talk to you, and I hope I get to see your face in person sometime again.
I hope
soon.
so too.
Yeah, thanks for this.
Thank you so much.
1, 2.
Written in Stone is produced by me, Chris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush for Plugtone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. And over the next few weeks, our patrons will be getting an exploration of essays and articles by some of the women we've mentioned. You can join and hear those for free at the link in your show notes. And remember, this show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. If you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review, join our Patreon, the Secret Stoners Club, and tell everyone you know. At the crag, at the gym, in the crowd at the comps you go to this summer, and together we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, one decade at a time. Secret Stoners. I'll be honest with you. I think this is my 5th podcast that I'm finishing today. We're rebooting the Power Company Climbing podcast, so I've been stacking episodes up there. I finished editing next week's conversation as well, and now, end of the session where I've been staring at this screen for way too long, I am talking to you all. But I do want to say that this conversation, first off, it was so much fun for me. I really enjoy talking with Alison, and I could do this for many, many more hours. And I hope I do get to do this for many, many more hours without a microphone on. I know that's blasphemy to a lot of you listening, but I do like to have conversations without a microphone on. Also, I don't know how many times I've messaged Alison about coming on the show, more than anyone else for sure. There is a close second. We're not going to talk about him just yet because there's still a chance. But I messaged her a lot. And here's what the deal is. She had been asked by Chris Kalous to be on his show many, many times. When I texted Kalous, he said he's been asking her twice a year, every year for the last 10 years. And it just hasn't happened yet. Alison had never done a podcast till this one. So I just kept gently asking, and I even offered to talk to Kalous, and she just didn't respond to that. She said, "Oh, that's really sweet of you," and that's really it. And then I just kept asking questions because I needed answers. And she was very happy to answer my questions. And eventually she said, I talked with Kalous and he said to go for it because our conversations would be radically different anyway. So thank you, Chris, for that. I appreciate the pass. Thank you. And I'm so glad that it happened. Really, especially after the next conversation that you'll be getting. And then one that's following that I haven't recorded yet, but it's on the schedule, and I will be recording it next week, or this week when you're hearing this. After getting those, this one feels like a linchpin of sorts because Alison was so instrumental in all of the worlds that are combined in this podcast. The media, which I'm drawing heavily from, the magazines, the books, the films, the videos, whatever. I'm drawing heavily from all of that. Also, the women of the 80s. She was doing First Ascent. She was helping push things forward. She was also in the beginning of the sport climbing movement, accepting it, which is an important piece of this. And she was at the forefront of the competitions, which just can't be overlooked. So far in this podcast, I have mostly overlooked the competitions. And it's not because I'm not aware of them and not paying attention to them. It's because there's so much to talk about. Geez, this thing was supposed to be 20 total episodes, 10 stories, 10 conversations. It was supposed to be that last season, supposed to be this season, and it's going to be way more. It's always going to be way more. I need to control myself a little bit. But it's hard when there's so much to talk about and so many interesting people who are willing to talk about it. So because she is at the intersection of all of these things, she just feels like an important piece of this. And I'm so happy to have had this conversation. Next week, you will be, well, first let me tell you this. There are still bonus episodes in the making, or in the research phase, but I'm still waiting on that last conversation before I go forward with any of those, because it might change what I do with those. Anyway, next week, you will be getting a really fun conversation. I had a ball. It was shorter than I wanted it to be. The time we had scheduled, things got mixed up, and we ended up with just over 30 minutes to talk. And it wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. But I did what I could, and it turned out, like I said, I just edited it today. So I was listening back, and it is a really fantastic conversation with this person. I really couldn't be happier with the way it turned out. So there's almost no way that I can't give this away if I give you any information. So I'm not going to. It's one of the women we've been talking about who we haven't heard from yet. Though now that I think back, I've probably already given it away. All right. I'll see you guys next week.